And welcome to Unit 5. So this is the first of what will be a series of kind of pre-recorded lectures that you guys will get on Mondays, which will be focused around particular thematic interests within the unit and which will kind of build on each other. Some weeks there'll be just kind of presentations on existing bodies of work. Some weeks they will be actual tutorials in techniques, and they'll vary depending upon what we're doing or what we're looking at that week. So in this first exercise, what we're going to be looking at is screens and how we kind of think about screens and how we talk about screens, what we kind of mean by screens possibly, and how we might challenge that notion. And then also looking at mapping techniques and how you guys will begin to kind of generate your own maps. So this initial drawing is a drawing by Rachel Whiteread, in which she's kind of looking at these windows as these kind of portal frames. So if you are unfamiliar with the work of Rachel Whiteread, I would suggest that you look into it a little bit more. One of the things that she's interested in is windows as kind of frames or windows as devices. So in her particular interest, there is a kind of fascination with the object nature of the window, but what we are much more interested in is the sort of portal nature of the window. So the window becomes a device through which architecturally we see the world, right? It frames a relationship between interior and exterior, or interior to interior, or exterior to exterior. It becomes this kind of communicative device. It's a piece of tissue that relates two things in relationship to one another. So there's always this sense of separation, but also connection. And that kind of ambiguity is quite interesting. And so what we want to do is we want to look at how windows become, in the lockdown, in the COVID world, a way in which we engage with the world or a way in which we're separated from it. So this idea that, you know, in your bedroom, you are kind of trapped perhaps to a certain extent, and you see the outside world and the window becomes a blockade to some extent. But similarly, the computer screen as a window becomes a gateway into a sort of, you know, a new landscape, or that kind of feeling of walking down a street and seeing a bunch of people kind of dining in a, you know, dimly lit restaurant, and, you know, people having wine and enjoying a meal with groups, you know, kind of pre-COVID thing, which, you know, you would walk down the street and look at and think, oh, that looks quite nice. And suddenly that kind of stuff takes on a whole new meaning within this landscape. So how windows are portals and how we think about windows as framing our view towards things. So two pieces that are kind of play with that idea are this piece by Penelope Haralambidou. She teaches at the Bartlett, and her PhD project was on Marcel Duchamp, and I believe it was called Architectures of Desire. I would very much recommend that you guys delve more into this. And one of the things she's looking at in this is binocular vision, that kind of, you know, the fact that we as humans perceive depth through this kind of left-right channel. It's through the binocular function or the binocular nature of the way that we see that give us depth and then begin to start to set up an experience, but also the way in which Duchamp, particularly in his work Étant donné, one of his last kind of major work, which you all need to look up and kind of read up a little bit about. But it's about how we encounter a work, how a work is framed, how we approach that work, and then how, when we arrive at that work, our experience of it is orchestrated. So similarly, on the right-hand slide, we see this behind-the-scenes shot of a set from Blade Runner. So we can see how this set has all been built slightly askew, and what that's for is kind of twofold. One, it's building the model set, thinking about how the camera is going to navigate it. So rather than, you know, making the camera work to a traditional reading of urban space, this model gets constructed so they can more easily navigate the camera around it, and also so that they can emphasize perspective. So the buildings all get constructed in such a way so that the depth of field seems exaggerated, so they're all kind of pulled out from this fabricated landscape. And then the camera moves around that. But the kind of critical idea here is that this thing has been created according to the logic of the camera, right? So the camera determines the way in which it's made. And so what we are going to be really cognizant of throughout this term is how we make things so that they get seen through the screen. Recognizing that your submissions will all be digital, they will all be PDFs, and they will all be films. We are designing them for the computer screen. So how do you take advantage of that? How do you begin to animate drawings? How do you begin to stage work in such a way that it plays through the navigation techniques of the screen that are inherent to the computer? Okay, so this will be ongoing discussions, but I just want to kind of place these nuggets in your guys' brains. So similarly on as we move into digital space, so obviously that all completely opens, right? So you move from, because of technological developments, you move from the physical sets of Blade Runner, which is 1984, into something like The Matrix, which is 1999, and the possibilities of green screen, the affordability of multiple cameras, suddenly completely change the ways in which we can think about how space gets navigated. So you can play much more freely and much more loosely because the sets can be completely designed digitally. And yet there's still this analog responsibility, right? So if we look on the left-hand image, the Superman kind of thing with these totally ridiculous dudes at the back, kind of like, you know, teasing out the cape and his hair to make it look like the wind is going. There's this interface between the digital and the manipulation of the analog within the digital space. So playing with that line between what is human, what is inhuman, what is analog, what is digital, etc., will be something that we'll be very interested in throughout. So this animation is a very early example of the flesher technique for animation. And what was revolutionary about the flesher technique was the way in which it produced depth within an animated frame. So up to this point, animations were very flat. It was a 2D person drawn on a 2D background, and there was no real depth to it. Now, the revolution in terms of the flesher camera was that it was filming the animation, which you can see here denoted as 11 and 12, this kind of still animation, which gets put on a series of transparencies in front of a three-dimensional set to give a real sense of depth with the animated figure on top. And what's interesting about this is that, again, it becomes this play between what is kind of fabricated, the animation, and also the three-dimensional, the real space kind of behind, and also the ways in which this is all constructed according to the logic of the camera. So we can see number 2, the camera, which can move along this track up and down. It can slide in and out. So there's this kind of perspective and depth of field. But then the actual set itself is constructed according to the aspect ratio of the camera. So there's no need to create, you know, an infinite landscape. There's no need to create space beyond what the camera can see, because everything is contained within the camera. If it's not in the camera, we don't see it. It doesn't matter. So again, within the computer screen, it's really important to think about, what do you see through the computer screen? How do you stage things according to the computer screen? And if we're not going to see it, does it matter? If it does matter, how do you reveal that it matters? And if it doesn't matter, don't show it, don't model it, don't bother, right? So again, it's this kind of interesting question of what is seen, what is unseen, and that's all according to the logic of the lens. So here we see that in plan again. You can see very clearly the perspectival field and how the model kind of, it kind of ceases to exist, right? It becomes a nothingness. It becomes a void outside of that space. And that's fine because we're never going to see it. So that logic we can see manifest in an architectural project like the Slow House by Diller and Scofidio. So hopefully, well, you guys might know this project, you might not, but it was basically a house which never got constructed for a photographer. And the kind of narrative interest for Diller and Scofidio for this project was thinking about the building as a sequence of spaces which unfold according to the logic of the camera. So we see that thinking manifest in the way it gets shown. So on the left-hand side, we see this model, which has a series of slides, which become these sectional planes, but they're also speaking to the language of photographic techniques. So the kind of glass plate photography. So immediately there's a dialogue between the way that they're thinking about the project, the narrative of the project, and the spatial unfolding of the project, and therefore the spatial qualities. So they're speaking the language of photography, even though it's in an architectural model. And what that does is it helps reinforce their narrative. So the way that we encounter this project is by this car. So we can see the arrival trajectory of the car. And as the car moves through these spaces, the space is open to reveal a view. So basically the way that you come to this project is through the forest. So you're driving through the forest. You arrive at this little house. It's a small opening. You move into the opening. As you move into it, the space itself begins to expand to reveal a view of a lake beyond. So we can see that even more clearly in some of these other diagrammatic models, where that view of the lake becomes framed. And again, the sort of the photographic nature of it is reinforced through the modeling itself. So they're very clear and very overt about the photograph as an object, which sits on the model, and the way that the architectural device relates to the trajectory and then the framing of this thing. Okay? Also worth noting is the ways in which Diller and Scofidio play around with representational techniques. So on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, we see the same model to some extent, right? It's the same project, and yet it's modeled in two very different ways. When combined with the previous slide, which is again obviously the same project, we see three different ways in which the same idea gets communicated. So on the left-hand side, we see this peeling away. The architecture is opening out, literally, right? It's these kind of thin pieces of fabric which get pulled, I mean, I think they're wood, but get pulled aside in order to reveal that view. So somehow here we get a sense of architecture as something which is tensile, but also malleable, highly malleable. In the previous one, we see architecture as something which is a frame that we move through. And on the right-hand side, we see architecture as a more stable object. So between each of these things, we start to get a more complete picture of what the actual thing is. So they're approaching it in a variety of ways, through drawing, through modeling, etc. And as we add up, suddenly we get a more complete picture. In this one, we see the rear view mirror. The rear view mirror at the bottom side of the drawing. The rear view mirror becomes a proxy for the automobile. So we see what we've arrived through. We see what was behind us. At the front, we see what we're arriving towards. And then we have a series of section drawings with elevations to the side, which show us again how the space is opened out with the car windshield, which serves again to reinforce the notion of arrival by vehicle, but also serves as the sectional plane of the drawing. And again, what they're doing here is they're playing. They're being really experimental and they're being really playful with what a drawing is and how you construct a drawing and how that drawing serves to describe a narrative. So here we have some other ways of modeling. I'm just going to jump through these really quickly. You guys can look at these yourselves if you want to later, but it's all about how we see the model, how we arrive at the model. What we're looking at here is a 45-degree mirror placed over the physical model so what they're thinking about here is how in a room you will read this thing. As you see this object in a room, you will read the plan and you'll read the object itself. And as you move, your understanding of that changes in relationship to the room. So again, it's playing with an object in space. Now, our objects are going to be in digital space, not in terrestrial space, but similarly, we'll be playing with these notions. So again, looking at some different photographs, ways it's communicated, different ways it's drawn, different ways it's drawn. different ways it's modeled, just playful, 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 just constantly testing, constantly thinking, how can I show this? What does this say about the thing itself? This is another staging of the exhibition, which was like many years later. So this has been a long project for them with lots of kind of iterations. And again, I invite you to explore them more. Okay, so now jumping back to the Flesher system, you can see a similarity again in terms of how the camera is moving into a space, how the space beyond that begins to unfold, and there's a certain staging there which is consistent with the architectural logic of Diller and Scofidio. I'm just going to jump ahead to the multiplane camera. So the next technological development in terms of animation was Walt Disney's multiplane camera. I'm just going to quickly jump. You guys can copy that URL down. I'm actually not going to show it here. You can just copy it down. But there's a very nice YouTube video which walks through how the multiplane camera works. And again, it's interesting in terms of thinking about how the screen becomes a device which things move into and out of. So you have something which sits kind of stage right or stage left, and until it moves into that space, the audience doesn't know about it. They're not aware about it. They're not aware of it, excuse me. And there's a choreography that occurs through that, which you guys need to be cognizant of in terms of how you think about drawings, how you think about models, how you think about scrolling through a portfolio, so that one image follows onto the next in a very sequenced, in a very choreographed way. And the more in control of that choreography you are, the better your projects are going to be. Now, designing how and where to look. This is just a continuation to think about the importance of directing people's gaze. On the left-hand side, we have an image of the Flesher model, and you can see how he's getting down, he's kind of ducking his head through to see as the camera sees. On the right-hand side, we have a Peter Zumthor model exhibition from the Venice Biennale, and here you can see how he's changing the heights of these models according to where people sit within the room. So some models are higher, some models are lower, and that completely changes how we relate to them. So if we see them at eye level of what would be the eye of a person approaching the project versus looking down at it from a more God's eye view, our understanding of that architecture is completely changed. And so thinking about how you show someone something as you choreograph this architectural unfolding, it'll be super important for you to be in control of these dynamics. So again, Diller and Scofidio, placing a model up, framing this horizontal view, it describes a space which on the one hand contains the object as a box, but similarly, because of the compression of the horizontal plane, it extends the space. So there's a kind of sense of the infinite within this tightly defined box because of how compressed that horizon becomes. They play this a similar game in different ways on different projects. So whether they have us kind of lie down on our backs and slide under something, or whether they pop something down from a space so that we have an architectural reveal, and all of these things are within the kind of fundamental games of what architecture is. And what I mean by that is the way in which you control what someone's looking at as they move through a building is one of the most important ways we can design spaces that are interesting. So how a space unfolds, thinking about a building not as a floor plan, but as a series of movements through space, and the way you can tease someone into that space, and the way you can surprise or delight someone within that space is what really creates great architecture. And these games go way back to kind of how humans began to understand perspective in the Renaissance. And it was about this idea of a fixed gaze through a plane to construct an image. This was like a revolutionary technique in terms of graphic representation. And there were all sorts of interesting diagrams in terms of how artists began to demonstrate how space is actually constructed versus how it's represented to be constructed. And this is simply a graphic representation that I think is interesting and worth you guys possibly exploring a little bit more in terms of revealing the dynamics of what's going on. So earlier when I'm talking about Blade Runner in terms of, what is inside the screen versus what is outside the screen, or the flesher as well, excuse me. Sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. What am I trying to say? There's a game to be played between what we actually see, what we don't see, and revealing the dynamics of that. So to a certain extent, what these drawings are doing is they're revealing the logic of how we see. So it's a kind of a descriptor event. So if you're showing us something, or if you're not showing us something, then how and why and where you reveal the kind of tricks behind that can be really interesting. So it's this idea of, like magicians never reveal their tricks. Well, sometimes it's really interesting to reveal the trick. Sometimes it's much more fun if you show off a little bit of the thinking that went behind it. Brian Cantley is someone who plays really overtly with this stuff. So he's at SciArc, and he takes this kind of perspectival field, which we can see which is trying to contain an architecture, and then we see an architecture which completely spills outside of that. So he's on the one hand relating back to these kind of early ideas of Renaissance perspectival understanding, and then he's totally blowing that box open with this kind of deconstructionist language. Okay, so all of that stuff was just to kind of introduce you guys to the notion of a screen and how the screen can be played with, and some of the tools that are used to do that. So it's just to plant some seeds and encourage you guys to kind of actively test or play with that kind of understanding. But for your first exercise, and what we want to be talking about on Friday, is we want to be talking about your COVID maps. Okay, so what you're going to do as groups, you're going to self-select your groups, and you guys are going to create together a series of drawings. First, I want you to generate in Miro a collaborative board in which you start just populating shared experiences. So shared reference points, shared images, shared feelings, shared spaces possibly, etc. And these can be really loose, playful things that you're just kind of, think about them as thinking devices. Once you've created these boards, we want you to turn them into a series of collage drawings. So let's say 5 to 10 collages. And what these collages are going to do is they're going to look at material interests. They're going to look at themes of isolation. They're going to look at sounds. They're going to look at whatever it is that you guys identify that you think is interesting, important, and they're going to be distillations of your maps. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a series of ways of thinking about mapping and approaching mapping that might challenge you guys and excite you guys as you launch into this exercise. So the first image is the Noli plan of Rome, right? This is a very kind of classic drawing, which you guys will have studied in architectural history, I hope, which looks at relations of space. So essentially, what is accessible space and what is inaccessible space? What is public realm and what is private realm? So there's a very simple duality here. Now, we can move beyond these dualities when we start to look at something like Louis Kahn's map of Philadelphia, where he completely removes the buildings to simply look at traffic flows. And with those traffic flows, we start to get an understanding of urban scale and urban patterns, which are more revealing in a lot of ways than the Noli plan. And yet still, because of their description, we have an understanding of urban scale at the same time. So the urban block is voided here, and yet we're aware of its presence because of its void. And all of these notations begin to reveal rhythms to the city that the Noli plan doesn't quite tell. So densities of traffic, direction of traffic, even topography changes. Okay, so we move beyond basic understandings, and here when we look at this kind of Dadaist representation of Paris, it becomes about relationality. So here we totally break away from an understanding of the city as something which is stable into something which is more relational, and it's more about the dynamics of here and there. Or if you think about going to London and getting on the tube, you get on at King's Cross and you get off at Old Street, and there's a huge section of city which sits between those two places, and somehow it becomes a no place because of how you navigated through. Or you get on a plane in Rome and get off in New York City, and similarly there's a vast geography which has been traversed, and somehow it just becomes a red dot. Right? A red line. So it's about relationships, and it's about dynamics between things. And the more specific you can be about what those things are, the more directive you can be in terms of a narrative and shaping a way in which a story gets told. So there's on the one hand, there's a very loose way of approaching map making, and on the other hand, there's a very technically precise way of making map making. So this map looks like it's something which is loose, and in actual fact, it's highly detailed and scientific. So Harold Fisk was a cartographer working for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he did this mapping project of the Mississippi alluvial plain. And basically he was taking soil samples across the floodplains of the Mississippi, and through taking these soil samples was able to determine how the course of the Mississippi changed over time. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at time. We're looking at how the river meandered across the plains over a period of great time. So this becomes a kind of a temporal study which reveals a natural pattern which occurs outside of the kind of human experience. So in this way, map making, the more, it's highly precise, and yet it tells this kind of poetic story about how we relate to time, what our relationship to deep time might be. Okay, Nicholas Feltron is someone else who uses specificity to create narrative. So I want you all to look at Nicholas Feltron's Feltron reports. These are available online on his website. And basically, it's a defunct project, but for a number of years, Nicholas Feltron was collecting data about his life and translating that data into maps. So this is kind of pre-digital to a large extent. This is certainly data harvesting in the way that we think about it now. And if you think about Facebook or whomever collecting these vast amounts of information, the general narrative is that these things are kind of depersonalized, and they reveal trends about humanity kind of writ large, but not necessarily about the individual. Obviously, there's huge privacy and security issues in terms of who is looking at our data and what they're using that data for in terms of the individual. And I think those are really ripe themes that you guys can play with. But here what Nicholas Feltron is doing is he's using data that he's collecting about his own life to understand his life better. So there's something about autonomy here, and there's something about kind of personal agency, which is really interesting. But also the maps are beautiful, and as we look through a series of maps, we begin to get an understanding of his yearly patterns and his yearly cycles. So for instance, this is just a map of New York City of meeting with this one particular person, and we can start to see densities and patterns of activity, which are quite interesting. When taken collectively with all the other maps, we have a real understanding of how Nicholas engages with the world. Similarly, Dennis Wood's project of mapping of Boylan Heights is also a very interesting way of thinking about cartography. So Dennis Wood is a highly influential cartographer, and his book Everything Sings is on our bibliography, and I expect you all to kind of seek out digital versions of this. There's quite a good repository of stuff online you can read and think about these maps. But what Dennis is so successful at doing is distilling particular pieces of information to create compelling maps that tell one story. When taken collectively, they begin to tell a much broader, more collective story. So for this project, he was mapping his neighborhood in North Carolina, which is called Boylan Heights. So on this particular map, we just have notations, right? Notations of traffic patterns. And what we can see through these notations, we can begin to identify particularly important nodes, right, of where traffic meets, and that allows us to read certain urban understandings into that, right? So we can begin to kind of understand what a space is like based simply upon the density and the type of traffic notation that gets shown. Here we have police calls, so we can start to get a reading of activity, illicit activity of one kind or another. Now, taken by itself, this might not reveal a lot, but taken in conjunction with this map, for example, we can begin to infer that perhaps in this lower right-hand corner, what we're getting an increase in traffic violations or traffic incidents. Now, I'm not sure if that's the particular truth, but between these two maps, it allows us to tell a story, to start to tell a story which is compelling. These are pools of light, so we can begin to see where there's light and where there's dark, where you might hide, where teenagers might go and smoke cigarettes or something else, where different types of activity occur. Here we have what he calls squirrel highways. So these are telephone lines. So we can begin to see the networks of communication and where houses are in relationship to one another and how avenues are formed according to where these lines run. But also the framing of the map as a squirrel highway reveals, one, a separation in terms of pedestrian space and kind of animal space, and the ways in which different things begin to move through this neighborhood. Here we have a map of jack-o'-lanterns. There's a very interesting narrative, which I invite you guys to explore about this particular map. There's a really nice This American Life podcast about mapping from 1996 or something, but you can find on This American Life's website, in which Ira Glass interviews Dennis Wood, and the whole episode is really nice about mapping. But Dennis speaks about this mapping project in it, and it's worth checking out. This map is about roof pitches, so we can start to understand the kind of volumetric layout, I guess, of neighborhoods. We can also start to read in the ways in which water moves across site, right? So how do roofs shed water, for example? Okay, Jareen Voigt is someone who approaches map making in a much more poetic storytelling way. So her maps become these narrative expressions of a variety of things. Okay, actually, you know what? I'm going to jump back to those. That slide was out of place. Sorry about that. I'm going to jump back to Jareen Voigt in a bit. So this is a mapping project by Tim Knowles, where he's mapping tree movements. So he tapes pens to trees, puts canvases underneath, and as the wind blows across the leaves, we get these concentrations and pools of ink. So this becomes a mapping of a natural process, the mapping of wind patterns, right? So there's a kind of poetry to the way he's thinking about map making. There's another device by Tim Knowles, which is called Wind Walk. So he built this helmet, and he allowed the wind to guide where he walked. So there's something about de-authoring here of the experience of navigating a city. And by de-authoring, it opens up new ways of engaging. So, we all get caught in these patterns of walking the same routes over and over again. And as we do that, we kind of stop thinking about how we're walking through a space. As soon as we start looking at one particular thing, say we're looking for stones, or say we're walking with a 2-year-old, say we're walking with a baby, say we're walking with a 80-year-old grandmother, say we're following the wind. Each of these things starts to create a new way of navigating space that reveals something specific about it. Walking in springtime versus walking in winter, walking when it's wet, walking when it's hot. Whatever it is, that determines to a large extent the way in which you walk. So as you start to do these COVID maps, I want you to think, what was it like that first time you got to go out of your house and go for a walk by yourself, ideally, And what did you feel? You know, how did space feel different? How did smells feel different? How did wind feel different? How did looking through a window feel different? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So start to try to kind of create these narratives around you moving through familiar spaces in a slightly unfamiliar way. So this is a drawing of his walk according to the wind. This is another project he did in which he put a drawing device in the back of his car and drove from the UK to Switzerland. And as he drove, the paper kind of fed through and created these wall drawings, which he then displayed in a gallery in Switzerland. So the work became the kind of process of arriving at the place. Here's a project by Richard Long in which he walked back and forth in space in the Utah desert and then took a photograph of this line. So it's something about map making being a direct engagement with the landscape and also something which is transient. So it's marking territory by mapping that territory, but then it disappears. And if you imagine the actual act of creating this work, there's a deliberateness to the way in which he's walking, which again changes his relationship to that space. So if that line were half as long and he walked it for twice as long of a time, again, that would be a completely different reading of this particular space. If he got down on his belly and crawled across this line, again, there would be a different reading of that space. So here's another work by Richard Long in which he drew a series of concentric circles and he walked each of those circles in one day. So obviously the outer circle, he's going to have to walk a lot faster in order to cover that distance versus the inner circle in a day, right? So how fast you walk through that space completely changes your understanding of it. Shoot, guys, my Jareen Voigt ones are out of sequence. I'm hoping they're going to jump back to this. Okay, so now we look at something which is material. So this is a project by Knoll where they took a series of latex castings of interior spaces. And those spaces then start to become ghosts that tell stories of the texture of a place. And then I think what's particularly interesting in this case is how those spaces get staged in another space. So it's kind of creating, to a certain extent, an outpost of a place in a new place. So as you start to think about your collages and your maps, you need to think about how you harvest kind of disparate places and bring them together in one collection. So on the one hand, you have a, half an hour walk around your neighborhood, your first kind of quarantine walk, what that feels like versus a Zoom call with a bunch of friends where you guys are just hanging out and whatever, trying to be normal versus a Snapchat conversation while you're out walking, 3 weeks into COVID or whatever. So there become a huge variety of ways in which we engage with place. And the question here becomes about, how do you collate these things together? How do you draw them and make a conversation so that they sit in proximity within a space? Now, this exhibition is done in a terrestrial space. You will be conducting these things in a digital space. At first, your drawings will be static, and then we'll make them kind of move. But here again, we see that kind of interesting relationship between the body and the place and the thing. And so I just want you to be kind of aware of that. Okay, I think this is actually going to be us with the Jareen Voigt stuff. So Jareen Voigt creates very beautiful maps which deal with kind of natural phenomenon to a large extent. So she says she combines line and text to diagram both factual and fictive activities, such as the flight of eagles, geographical directions, wind patterns, rotations, shifting horizon lines, top 10 pop charts, kisses, and electrical currents. So these maps become kind of narrative devices to understand and explain phenomena. So music, for example. She has a beautiful series of drawings of Beethoven sonatas. So how music moves, how wind moves, how an eagle's wings move, how two people come together to embrace, or in the case of COVID, how two people are separated and are trying to connect. How you kind of map these things can be elegant and poetic and expressive. And Doreen Voigt does a great job of combining large gestural movements with specificity. So even though we might not necessarily know what all of her notations mean, we can read rhythms in them and we can also believe a certain logic. Now, she's not here to describe what this drawing is telling, but there is very clearly a logic which guides its direction. So as you guys are making your maps, there's kind of this game which always needs to be played between when you're being specific and when you're being loose. And it's on you, it's your responsibility as a designer to tell that story graphically of how these things are connected, and then in your presentation of them to tell us how they were constructed, okay? So Doreen Voigt has an amazing collection, a repository on her website, and I really encourage you guys to engage with that and to look at her maps, to look at interviews with her, to look at, think about, talk about how she creates maps. And here we kind of jump into more textural mappings as well. This is a different project by Holly Rumble called Hear a Pin Drop. So what this project is a mapping of urban space. The idea is when and where and how can you hear a pin drop? So we navigate her kind of her reading or her project here is about how you move through a space, an urban space, and how you understand that. So what you're looking for is you're looking for a place where you can drop a pin and hear it. Now, if you imagine Christmas, 5 days before Christmas, walking down Princess Street pre-COVID, if you drop a pin, you're not going to hear it, right? If you're in Waverly Station as a train's coming in, you're not going to hear it. So what she's doing with this prompt is she's asking people to start reimagining their urban spaces and hunting for spaces of a particular sonic quality. And again, what that does is it frames the way in which you engage with a space, and therefore you start looking about a space differently. And also that different urban spaces are going to start to read differently according to their acoustic properties. So if you're in the it's early morning and you're in the meadows and you drop a pin on the path, you might hear a little tinkle. Because of that kind of open space, that sound's probably going to get lost. Now, if it's a wet day, again, really early in the morning or really late at night, and you drop a pin in one of the closes off the Royal Mile, you're going to hear that reverberation probably off of the stone. It's a tight, claustrophobic space. So suddenly, the same act of the pin drop starts to speak a very different material language in terms of what urban space is. So these become, then there's a photographic record of where people were able to identify a pin dropping, and then that gets placed on a map, and suddenly you start to get an understanding of the city as a space in which certain places are quiet and certain places are not. So we can kind of infer that if a space is not photographed on this map, that it's a noisy space, right? That might not be the case, but we can at least make that inference. Okay, now, David Lem. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about David Lem's work because I've invited him to give a lecture for the weekly lectures, which are going to be happening in week 3. But I want to introduce you to his work so that you guys can research it a little bit and begin to use him as an example when you're thinking about collage. Because one thing that David does really well is use collage as a storytelling device, and in a way that's very playful. So he plays with his own photographs and found photographs and objects and found admiralty charts and scale, playing with notation, all sorts of different things in a way to create a relationship of things in space which become narrative prompts. Again, check out David's website. Find interviews and kind of engage with them, and then we'll be hearing from David more specifically about how he works in week 3. But I want you guys to start looking at these as a way of thinking about collage. Here we have a process piece from one of his residencies. I think this was on Egg, but you can see how he's finding a stone, he's finding a little object in space. He's starting to kind of doodle in ways. He's starting to subdivide space. He's looking at natural patterns. He's looking at scales. He's looking at color palettes. And he's starting to combine those things and think about their relationships to each other. So I want you to think about these collage drawings as relationships. You begin with the Miro boards. You'll create large narrative maps that are shared between a bunch of people, well, 3 people. And then you will start to think about shared textural experiences or shared emotional states or shared whatever, meals, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now you start to put those things in proximity with each other in some kind of graphic form, and suddenly they start to communicate to each other and layer up. And so this is the game that you guys are going to be playing this week. So think very carefully about what the objects are, what the objects say. Think very carefully about what the textures are or what the materials are. Think about how you photograph things in your bedroom. Think about how you photograph things out in the real world in a way that frames them specifically. And then think about how you put them next to each other in combination with drawings, which tells us something about those things. How those things sit next to each other or don't sit next to each other. How you force relationships, etc. As you do that, be really aware of how you take the photographs. So as we're looking at this thing, the thing as a photograph is beautiful. It tells a certain story just in and of itself in terms of a consideration. We know because of the way that he's placed the paper, we know because of the way that he's lit this whole thing, that he's thinking about and careful in what he's doing. Therefore, we believe it and we also care about it because we can see that he cares about it. So, how you stage things within your bedroom, on your desk, whatever, is super, super important, okay? Always, always, always be thinking about how this thing gets staged so that it gets seen. It's not a scrapbook, it's a presentation. Everything should be documented according to presentation standards. Then these are more evolved drawings of David's, and you can see how he begins moving some of these shapes, how he begins moving some of these textures, forms, etc. into a more polished graphic language, okay? So again, your task is to first create a series of lockdown collages. 5, 10, 20, as many as you need. Absolute minimum of 5. And that's individually. So that'll be 15 per group. Sorry, 15 per group. These can happen very quick though, okay? Some of them might take more time, but some of them can be very quick. But do as many as you need. And then start to combine them together. So you do 5 individually, and then you'll bring them together and you'll talk about them, and you guys will select out 5 or more to show Andy and I on Friday, okay? So each come together, create this Miro board as a group, then break away and individually make 5 to 10 to 20 to 50 to 150 collages. Then with your groups, before you meet with us on Friday, we want you guys to come together and talk about the maps, find similarities, and select among all of the ones that you guys have created, 5 that we're going to talk about on Friday. All of those images, all of the collages should go into your Miro boards so we can look about and talk about them. But we should be able to see the process ones. We should be able to see all the ones that you created. And then we should be able to see the ones that you've selected from those, okay? So there should be a clear process of selection on the Miro board itself. What we'll be looking at next week then is how we translate these collages into moving images. And I will start to I will give you guys some After Effects, the first After Effects tutorial, okay? If you want to start playing around in After Effects now, that's awesome. If you have engaged with it, great. If you haven't engaged with it, we're going to start engaging with it soon, so I would encourage you to start checking out YouTube tutorials or Linda tutorials or whatever. But for right now, collages. So make your Miro boards, think about windows, think about screens, think about frames, and we cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. And we'll speak soon. See y'all later. Bye.